Chapter 11. The three of them chatted for a while, before a group of doctors, headed by Director Ethan, arrived in the ward. The shocked expressions they wore when they saw the state of Celine were quite funny. Kinyu was still worried about her mother's health, but Keith and Celine really enjoyed the disbelief and agitation that the doctors were drowning in as they conducted the tests on her. After the results of the tests came out, and Celine was proven to be in good health, the doctors turned to look at Keith with a hated gaze. Even Ethan, the director of Soviena Health Clinic, who was also a proud member of the Royal Medical Academy, looked like he was ready to kneel in front of him. However, Keith had already decided on how he wanted to approach this matter. And he did not give anyone time to approach him and start trying to please him. If you are curious about my medical skills, I can tell you that they are not conventional modern or ancient, Western or Eastern skills. My medical skills come as an inheritance, and I cannot divulge its secrets to the world. So do not bother asking me to teach my techniques to you. His blunt words poured cold water over their excitement, and they looked like lost puppies. If it was someone else, they would have still pestered him, but the person in front of them was the heir of the Demiliore family. They did not have the guts to upset him at any cost. But they still looked a little unconvinced. Keith knew that making all these brilliant doctors sad would not be beneficial to him in the future, and it was an opportunity for him to make them subjects who would always respond to his call as loyal dogs. And he was already smirking in his heart. Ethan knew better than the rest that such medical inheritances existed in the world. And it was not something that ordinary mortals like them could afford to deal with. He was about to request the doctors to leave the ward when Keith spoke the next words that left him and the rest of the doctors brimming with excitement. However, I can see how much you all are dedicated to the medical studies, and since my skills are not just restricted to a single field or times, you can consult me if a dire need arises. I will gladly help you, but please, remember to only consult me if it is a dire situation. No offense to you in this noble profession, but I cannot dedicate my life to its cause. I have a lot more responsibilities on my shoulders, he seriously said. Also, please do not divulge my identity as a doctor to the outside world without my permission. We understand, young Master Demiliore. Ethan readily nodded his head, and the rest of the doctors promised to listen to his words. Kinyu stood on the side looking at everything in a daze. She could not fathom how all these renowned doctors of the world looked at Keith as if he was the king of medicine. It was not because she doubted his ability, but because she did not have the understanding of medicine that these doctors possessed. They understood that what Keith pulled off by saving Celine was nothing short of a miracle. But what really intrigued Kinyu was Keith himself. He was the same age as her, had been her classmate for years, and she was aware of his academic ability that was on par with her if not better. She always regarded him as a future rival, but now she felt a little inferior to him. And when Kinyu realized that she was yet to thank him for saving her mother, she felt ashamed of her neglectfulness and her heart grew very uncomfortable. Keith, you don't know what it means to me, and words cannot really express my gratitude, but thank you. Thank you for saving my mother. She stepped forward and sincerely said to him as soon as the doctors, with the exception of Ethan, left the ward. It's okay, Miss Lin. Keith politely smiled at her and nodded his head. I am happy with your thanks, so rest assured. He said and then proceeded to inform her about the 18-month treatment plan he had come up with. He told her how Celine should spend the duration of it, and asked her to keep a check on the diet of her mother. He also recommended a few light exercises that she could help her mother with. Heir Demiliore, I would like to invite you to my office for coffee if you have time on your hands. Ethan politely said when Keith was done talking to Kinyu. I have some work to attend to in the afternoon, so I must take my leave now. Keith politely smiled at him. I will visit your office on the day Miss Smith is discharged from the clinic. I will take your word for it, Heir Demiliore. Ethan smiled at him, and rest assured that Miss Smith will be looked after with responsibility. Keith nodded to him and then turned to look at Celine to say goodbye. Little Keith, aren't you forgetting something? Celine sternly looked him in the eyes, reminding him that he was yet to make a request to her. Keith sighed helplessly, but it was all a pretense. He already had something in mind that he wanted. Then I will be impolite, auntie. There is indeed something that you can help me with. He looked at her and smiled. What is it? I want your robin's nest. Celine looked at him in surprise, but then a bright smile bloomed on her face. I will send you the deeds and the keys to that villa by this evening. It's yours now. She accepted his demand, but I must say that you are very greedy. You want your aunt's favorite villa. She smirked at him. Well, I can't help but want it when I look at it. It is a beautiful house. He smiled back at her, not in the least embarrassed by the demand he had made. Celine was not dissatisfied at losing her favorite house to Keith, instead, she was actually happy in her heart that he wanted it. In her mind, she was already giggling at the thoughts that she entertained. And there was a playful smile on her face after she glanced at her daughter. Kinyu stayed silent on the side, but her heart was really agitated. Robin's Nest was not just her mother's favorite house, but it was also very special to her. She was born there. When she was younger, she had always dreamed of one day bringing her child into this world in the same house that she was born in. She wanted to spend her life in that house with the man she would choose for herself. It was meant to be her nest in the future. Of course, Keith knew all about it. It was the reason why he asked for it. Now, whenever Kinyu will think of Robin's Nest, his face will come up in her mind. And slowly, he will creep into her dreams and become the face of the man she always wanted to spend her life with in that house. Thank you for listening to my selfish demand, Aunt Celine. I will take my leave now. Be safe, he politely said to Celine and nodded to Kinyu before taking his leave. Or, little Kinyu, Keith stole your dream house. Celine teased her daughter when the door behind Keith closed. What will you do now? Mama, Kinyu complained and lowered her head in embarrassment. She did not think her mother knew about it, but now she felt even more dissatisfied because her mother gave the house away even after knowing that it was her dream house. Is that house worth more to you than your mother's life? Celine suddenly turned serious and asked. Her question made Kinyu panic and the little girl's mind sobered up from all the dissatisfaction. No, Mama. Kinyu stepped forward and hugged her mother tightly. How can it matter to me more than you? I know. Celine giggled and comforted her daughter by stroking her back. And it is not like you cannot visit that house anymore. Keith is your classmate, and you have known him for years. You two will make really good friends. She did not say anything more, and as Kinyu thought over her mother's words, she could not help but nod her head. After that, Celine made Kinyu tell her more about Keith, and the two ladies chatted happily. Outside the Soviena Health Clinic, inside a limited edition Bentley Express 10GT, Keith was looking at the picture of him and his friends. There was a cold glint in his eyes as he stared at each of their faces. He already knew the ones that were superficial friends, who were only there for benefit, but after learning from Kinyu that most of the class knew about their plan for today, he decided to keep an eye on those two that fell with him in the future. I was meant to be pitted from the start. He mockingly chuckled and shook his head. He was meant to lose a bet today, and he was going to accept the dare to make Lin Kinyu fall in love with him. But, unbeknownst to him, Kinyu was going to be made aware of the bet. And that would have led to her having a bad impression of him, which would eventually make it impossible for her to trust him. Had he not known the future, he would have not taken a different approach with Nana. He would have not brought her mother to this clinic. He would have not come here today, but instead would have attended the event as planned, and he would have fallen into the trap that was the beginning of his downfall. As he thought over it, he could not help but laugh mockingly. Chapter 12. Although he excused himself from the clinic saying that he had something to deal with, the truth was that Keith was too tired after performing the node tracing healing technique on Celine. It had nearly consumed all of his aura reserves, and he was in a dire need to sleep. Keith went to bed as soon as he arrived in his manor, and woke up 6 hours later at dusk. The sleep did the work, and he finally felt vitalized again. He asked for his supper to be sent to his study and got onto the work that he had on his mind. Tonight, he had to finish a very important matter that could not be delayed any longer. With the knowledge of the future, knowing the storylines of various protagonists from the stories he read in his dream, he wanted to form timelines of major events that will be taking place over the course of the next 3 years. Since the first story that the author wrote was his own, and every other story started only after its end, the work he would have to do to recall every minor detail of the past events in those stories was not going to be easy. There was simply not too much information on the past events that did not involve the protagonists and the heroines, and they were not Keith's goals for now. He had realized that the future around him was changing its course, and so he did not want to mess things up by dealing with the protagonists and the heroines ahead of time. The fate plundering system did not explain to him in detail how it worked because it had to urgently go into hibernation mode, but its name was a dead giveaway. And Keith had a pretty good idea of how it functioned. I have to plunder the fate from the protagonists, but I must not rush into it. The storyline needs to be preserved as much as possible in order to keep things under my control. He pondered over the matter and made his decision. His instincts were telling him that he shall not deal with the protagonists ahead of time. Who knows what backlash he might face, and as the favored children of destiny, they were bound to have some sort of heavenly luck. So, there was a high chance of him failing, and it could prove counterproductive. What if because of his actions the protagonists ended up becoming stronger ahead of time? It was a risk that he simply could not take. Also, it would be more fun if I let those protagonists grow and then deprive them of everything that should have been theirs from right under their noses. He smirked and got to work. Even if he could not deal with the protagonists, the heroines, and to an extension with the important supporting characters, it did not mean that he could not change the stories of the miscellaneous characters, and avail from the miscellaneous events that had little to no impact on the lives of the protagonists before the start of their stories. Keith worked till dawn, and by the time he finished, he had formed 2 different timelines. One was about miscellaneous events that were going to take place over the course of the next 3 years, which would prove immensely profitable for his business, and the other was a timeline of some characters that he had picked after much thought. He knew that the enemies he would be facing in the future were not going to be alone. Some of those protagonists were going to have very powerful subordinates and organizations under their commands. And so, he decided to find himself a group of powerful subordinates as well. The ones he picked were either minor characters in the stories or were only mentioned at some point in time. Of course, the list was not long and only contained a few people after he had carefully picked which ones he wanted, but each and every one of them possessed immense potential. And he was going to approach his first target the next weekend. Young master, Cesar is asking for permission to enter. He has some news for you, Yinjing informed him. The girl had been standing at the door the entire night he had been working, protecting him silently as his shadow. When he raised his head and looked at her expressionless face and clear eyes, he could not help but gently smile at her. Even if it was just a dream, he was quite angry with himself that he had not appreciated her more. He was the sole reason for her existence, and he had never paid much attention to her. Let him enter. He nodded to her and then started wrapping things up. He saved the timeline of business opportunities on his laptop but got rid of the timeline of his potential subordinates after making sure that he had memorized all the details. Young master, Cesar politely bowed to him, and after Keith nodded, he took his seat on the table. I have contacted Damien Angelini and informed him about Chiara and what you plan to do. He is rushing over from Orchid City with his wife and son, and will arrive at Samaritan International Airport at 10 a.m. That's good. Keith nodded to him. He was not surprised by the anxiousness of Damien. He knew what he would do as soon as he learned about Chiara. Your appointment with Chairman Angelini is set at 3 p.m. in the afternoon, Cesar informed him. You are allowed to only bring 2 bodyguards with you. There was a little worry in his voice as he said that. Don't worry about it, Uncle Cesar. I will be fine. He smiled at him. I will take Victor and Yinjing with me. As you wish, young master. I will inform Victor. He accepted his master's decision. Damien wants to meet you and Chiara before you head to the Angelini estate. Is that so? He smirked. Tell him that I will meet him, but he will only get to meet Chiara after my meeting with his grandfather. Cesar nodded in compliance, was about to ask for leave when Keith spoke again. I will be going to Bastille City on Thursday. Yinjing and Victor will go with me. Make the arrangements for a 4-day stay, and it should be somewhere in the Eastern District within a 15-minute drive from the Belle Harbor. Cesar frowned when he heard that, and was quite curious why his young master wanted to go to a minor city like Bastille and wanted to stay near a place that was one of the smuggling hubs of the country. However, he did not ask any questions. It will be arranged, young master. Thank you, Uncle Cesar. He looked at him and politely said. He knew better than ever that having a loyal subordinate like Cesar was the greatest of the blessings. It's my duty, young master. Cesar respectfully bowed to him, and then took his leave. Come here, Yinjing. He smiled at his shadow and watched her gracefully walk up to him. Yes, master. Give me a massage, my shoulders are a little stiff. Yinjing obediently came to stand behind him and then used her slender hands to knead his shoulder muscles. Her technique was sublime, and Keith could not help but close his eyes to enjoy the feeling. Yinjing. Yes, master. Are you in love with me? The sudden question froze Yinjing, but within a few seconds, she collected herself and continued with the massage. Yinjing's duty is to protect her master. She has no right to be in love with him, she answered in a monotonous voice. Keith raised his hand, and Yinjing stopped massaging his shoulders. Is that so? He turned his chair around and looked her right in her beautiful light brown eyes. Seeing her eyes quiver, he smiled and stood up, towering over her. She was 8 years older than him, but her stature was rather small. With a height of 5 feet 2, she was an entire foot shorter than him, and so she had to raise her head to look at him from up close. Keith gently caressed her fair cheek and stroked her cheekbone with his thumb. She was well trained and hid her emotions to the best of her ability, but as soon as leaned in and sipped a kiss from her soft and thin pink lips, she trembled slightly. He evilly smiled at finally getting a reaction out of her, and separated from her after taking another sip of her lips. You have my permission to be in love with me, he assertively said and turned around to walk out of the study, leaving her frozen in her place with his words echoing in her mind. Yinjing watched his leaving back, and soon a rosy blush crept on her cheeks. But as his shadow, she did not dwell much in her thoughts and swiftly followed after him. His taste and warmth still lingered on her lips, and her heart that had always kept her affection for him a secret, now finally free of those shackles, was beating in sweet rhythms. Chapter 13 Inches. Where are we going, brother? Kiara was quite curious about why Keith was dressed in a suit and had asked her to wear a dress as well. What was even more strange was that there was a driver in the car. He had never before brought a driver with him when he visited her, but today, he came in a limited edition Bentley Express 100 GT, with a tall and muscular man driving it. And his pretty bodyguard was with them in the car too, but Kiara was acquainted with her, so her presence was not strange. We are going to visit the Angelini estate to see Chairman Angelini. Keith lightly smiled at her. Angelini estate. It only took her a second to answer her own question. You mean the Angelini family? Her eyes widened in disbelief when she recalled the names of the 6 major families in the Sumerian city. Angelini family had been quiet in recent years, but they were still immensely powerful and wealthy. Their roots date back to over 2 centuries in the Sumerian city, and the power they held in their hands was not worse than that of the Demiliore family. And currently, they were the 4th wealthiest family in the city. Yes, Keith nodded his head. But why are we going there? She frowned and asked. Your mother was the daughter of the Angelini family. He looked at her in her beautiful blue eyes and said. His words caused her body to tense up, and she frantically looked at him. I know that you are adopted. He gently smiled at her. And I know that you have long figured out that I am your brother. It's how? She lowered her head and asked. Well, it was a guess, but you just confirmed it. He teasingly chuckled. His words made Kiara feel cold, and all the depression she was feeling was soon washed away by her brimming rage. Her beautiful blue eyes dangerously narrowed at him, knowing that he was messing with her. It was not a guess. He had always known it. And what made her angrier was the fact that Keith did not have anything to say to her about their relationship. She had always been curious as to why Keith had always been there in her life. And her parents, who were actually her adopted parents, had never had any complaints about her meeting him and going out with him. Over the years, she had realized that she looked nothing like her parents. It was quite obvious since her beauty could not have been inherited from either of them. There were no features that she shared with them, but she never voiced her questions, not really minding that she was adopted. They had raised her with care and affection, and she did not have a reason to blame them for anything. Her curiosity about her birth parents had always been there, and one day, she had finally concluded that she was possibly Keith's little sister. They shared a lot of similar features, such as their hands and feet, high cheekbones, pitch black hair, and the shape of the ears. And that was not all, they even had similar tastes in food and shared similar interests. And since Keith was her brother, it meant that Michael Demiliore was most likely her father. Being smart for her age, she had long concluded that she was an illegitimate child. Why are you taking me to the Angelini family? Kiara seriously asked. Shouldn't you take me to the Demiliore estate since I am your younger sister? Keith stared in her eyes for a while, not saying anything, and then leaned on her to plant a kiss on her forehead. If I bring you to the Demiliore estate, my mother will kill you. He said and smiled when he saw her body tremble at his words. And it is for the best that you take your mother's family name. Why? Kiara lowered her head and asked. Keith knew exactly what her question was directed at. She wanted to know why he planned on disturbing her life and killing all her hopes. Because, he leaned near her ear and whispered the answer, which froze her mind, but after a few seconds, her misty eyes looked at him in hope. Really? Yes, Kiara. He affectionately smiled at her and planted another kiss on her forehead. As soon as he confirmed it for her, she tightly hugged his arm and rested her head on his shoulder. She closed her eyes and wore a smile on her lips that reflected the happiness that she was basking in. Half an hour later, the Bentley entered through the gate of Angelini estate, and Kiara was in awe of the castle that was similar to the famous Chateau de Chambord but looked even more majestic and fortified. It was a dreamlike home, and she kept staring at it all the way. Welcome to the Angelini Manor, young Master Demiliore. An old man in his 50s, with tall and muscular stature, wearing a black tailcoat, politely bowed to him as he stepped out of the car. Keith stared at the man as he straightened his back and looked right into his cold eyes. He was the head butler of the Angelini family and the man who had killed his maternal grandfather. Good afternoon, Saul. He lightly smiled. Is Chairman Angelini awake? Yes, Saul nodded to him with a smile. The chairman is waiting for you in his study. Please come with me. After you. Keith grabbed Kiara's hand and pulled her inside the Angelini manor, following Saul. Victor and Yinjing were tensed when they found the shadow guards of the Angelini family stationed inside the manor. They were not just there for security. Their presence was meant to intimidate them. Even if they knew that the chances of anything going wrong were very low, they did not dare to drop their guard and stayed vigilant. Saul was surprised to see that Keith showed no trace of worry in his expressions, and the slight smile on his face had not ceased at all. He inadvertently looked at the girl that Keith brought with him, who was looking around the place curiously, and his heart trembled when he found the resemblance to a beautiful lady he had watched grow up under his care. However, he kept the questions in his heart and did not speak with Keith. If his guess was right, the truth will come out eventually. Master, Heir Demiliore is here. Saul knocked on the door of the study and spoke. Let him enter, an aged but heavy voice called out, and Kiara tensed up at the indifference that the voice reflected. Saul opened the door for Keith to enter, and after nodding to his bodyguards, he pulled Kiara inside the study with him. Yinjing and Victor pensively stood at the door together with Saul, not saying anything. Inside the study, there was an old and frail man in his early 90s, sitting at the desk, looking at some files. Even if he was very old and weak, his regal presence was profound as ever. This old man was Darius Angelini, master of the Angelini family, and the chairman of the Angelini group of industries. When Keith entered the study, Darius did not even raise his head to look at him, and it showed his stand towards the Demiliore family. However, Keith did not mind it and calmly walked over to the desk with Kiara. Good afternoon, great father, he greeted with a smile. The old man's hand stopped when he heard how Keith addressed him, and finally, he raised his head and looked him in the eyes, closing the file and placing it on the table. Demiliore and Angelini families were closely knitted to each other with blood ties. Both of Keith's maternal and paternal grandmothers were Angelini, and Chairman Angelini's daughters, which made him the old man's great-grandson. It was the first time that the two of them were meeting each other, and they kept sizing each other up for a while. Darius' eyes finally smiled a little after he was impressed with Keith's demeanor, and nodded to him, gesturing him to take the seat. Sit, Kiara, Keith called out to the girl by his side when he found her looking intently at the old man. His words brought the attention of the old man to the little girl, and just a look at her in her blue eyes was enough for him to understand her identity. And then his aged grey eyes, which had once been blue, looked severely at Keith for an explanation. I hope you have an explanation, Heir Demiliore, the old man gravely said. She is the main reason why I have come here today, great father. Keith did not beat around the bush sharing any pleasantries and got straight to the point. Speak. Darius gave him permission to state his purpose for coming here. The return of Angelini and Demiliore alliance through marriage. Keith looked Darius in the eyes and said, Chiara Angelini, daughter of Damien Angelini, will wed Keith August Demiliore, son of Michael and Vanessa Demiliore, and become the future lady of the Demiliore family. Darius frowned at his words and sank back in his chair, looking at Keith intently. She's not Damien's daughter. When the old man finally spoke after a few minutes, a smile crept on Keith's lips. He did not show it, but he had been quite tense, and now, the tension was relieved because Darius did not seem to reject his intentions. She is Uncle Damien's daughter, he meaningfully said and turned silent. Does your mother know that you have come here today? Darius spoke again after a while and the frown on his face disappeared. Now, his aged eyes were playful. She's not the master of the Demiliore family, nor is she the heir of the Demiliore family. Keith lightly said and kept eye contact. Is that so? The old man playfully asked before his expressions turned cold and his eyes bore right into the young man. Your father's actions brought a lot of shame to my family, Heir Demiliore. And the blood was shed and remembered. Your son's actions brought more shame to your family, destroyed the relations between our families, destroyed your family, and blood was shed and remembered in my family too. A chilling silence followed after his reply, and Chiara, who was not aware of what they had just talked about, found her hands and feet turning cold in her anxiety. She had never before heard Keith speak so coldly, and her heart was now palpitating in fear. Chapter 14. You could have kept her secret from us if you just wanted to marry her. But you speak of an alliance, why Heir Demiliore? Darius tapped his finger in the armrest and asked. It was not that Darius did not know the reasons, but he wanted to listen to them from Keith's mouth. He wanted to see if Keith was honest about his motives or not, and more than that, he wanted to understand the confidence reflected in the boy's eyes. Your health is deteriorating, great father. Keith lightly smiled. I am sure your doctors have informed you that you only have a little more than a year of life left in you. The old man did not say anything in reply and just kept looking at him, waiting for him to finish everything he had to say. The Falcon family already has plans for the Angelini, Keith gravely said as he remembered clearly what would happen after the passing of Darius Angelini. And Falcon are not alone, they have allied with another major family, the Grayson, and a few minor families to devour the wealth of Angelini. Your business is already infested with moles, just waiting for the right time. And as soon as you die, it will be the end of your business empire. And you know who they are? The old man lightly smiled and asked. Of course, he was not surprised that the enemies had plans for his family. The enemies have always been there, and the Angelini family, in their 267 years of history since their arrival in Cimmerian City, have always stood tall. I have a list of the key culprits. Keith smiled at him confidently. And as for the reason why I want this alliance is because the fall of Angelini will embolden the greedy. They will come after the Demiliore next. Our family survived the worst of the times in the last 2 centuries because we stood together, but now, we are broken and divided. The list of our enemies is only getting longer, great father. And if we stay divided because of a generation's mistakes, it would be an insult to our ancestors that stayed shoulder to shoulder for centuries. He sighed and took a deep breath. If you agree to accept Chiara in the family, give her the inheritance that was meant for her mother, and agree with the marriage, your estranged grandson and his family are ready to return to the Angelini estate today. I have already talked with Uncle Damien about it. He is also ready to take on the responsibilities of being the future master of Angelini family. He knew that the greatest worry of the old man was his estranged grandson, who left the family after what happened with his sister and did not even show up at the funeral of his parents. Damien and his son were the only males left in the main family. The Angelini family was currently without an official heir. Darius was not willing to hand the power to a branch family, which would only result in the dissatisfaction of the rest of the branch families, leading to an implosion of the Angelini empire. It was not wise to do it, and he knew clearly that if Damien does not return, the annihilation of Angelini is inevitable. He had tried everything in his power to convince Damien to come back, but he always refused. The low his father had fallen to had sickened Damien, and the injustice that was done to his sister was something he could never forgive. But now that he knew that he had a niece, his sister's blood and flesh, he was willing to do everything in his power to keep her safe. But of course, the premise was that his niece would receive everything that his sister was deprived of. Are these your words or Damien's words? Darius smiled and asked, his grey eyes gleaming in hope. It was Uncle Damien that brought up the inheritance, and the rest was proposed by me and accepted by him. He honestly answered. Darius stopped tapping his finger on the armrest and straightened a little in his chair. What you propose sounds good, but it is clear that your family gains a lot from this alliance compared to my family. After my death, the Angelini business would take a hit, and by the time my great-grandson is old enough to take the reins of the business, the Angelini would have most likely become a branch to your family. He narrowed his eyes at Keith as if trying to search his soul. That's still the best option on the table for you, Keith smirked. But rest assured, great father, I won't allow my mother to devour the Angelini family or your business. The hit the Angelini business will take is inevitable, but the severity can be lessened a lot through the alliance. Yes, Uncle Damien cannot take control of the business because of his military responsibilities, but his wife, Danielle, is a successful businesswoman. She can take care of the Angelini business with the help of Saul and the other loyal subjects of your family. She may not be as fierce as my mother, but she is a talented businesswoman. Darius contemplated over his words and sighed. He knew that Keith was right. Even if the Angelini ended up becoming the branch of Demiliore, it was still a better result than the extermination of the entire family and the efforts of his ancestors. Things would have been a lot different had Damien not been so stubborn, but years of regret had made Darius realize how his grandson felt about the family, and he could not find it in his heart to blame him for his stand after everything that happened. He took a deep breath to calm down his nerves when the face of his son appeared in his mind. It would forever remain his greatest regret that he had given the power to a fool like him. Your mother is not a woman who can be controlled, heir Demiliore. Even if you have no intentions against the Angelini, your mother won't miss out on the opportunity the alliance would provide to devour my family. Darius seriously said. Great father, I know my mother better than anyone in the world. Yes, you are right. She would have such thoughts, but I am confident enough to promise you that nothing of such sort would happen. She won't do it, he resolutely said, and there was no smile on his face now. Darius meaningfully looked his in his clear eyes, and then sank back in his chair. Have you talked about everything with your grandparents? Keith lightly smiled at Darius' question. I did not inform them about my decision, but in the morning I received a message from grandfather asking me to be safe. As the heir of the family, he did have his freedom, but his grandfather was still the master of the family. Yes, Cesar would never talk about his affairs to anyone, not even to his mother, but he was obliged to inform his grandfather about his visit to the Angelini estate. And since his grandfather had not asked him to reconsider his decision or stop him from coming here, it meant that he had tactfully approved of his decision and given him a free hand. For Darius, this answer was enough, and he then closed his eyes with a thoughtful expression on his aged face. Kiara nervously looked at her great father, whom she had met for the first time in her life, and prayed that he would agree to Keith's proposal. Tell Damien to come here. Since he is her father, only he can accept your proposal for marriage. As for the alliance, inform your grandparents to come to see me. The old man opened his eyes and smiled at Keith. It's been years since my daughter and son-in-law came to see me. I miss them. Keith was overjoyed when he heard Darius's words, and his brilliant smile reflected his happiness. Thank you, great father, he gratefully said. Darius only nodded to him and then turned to look at Kiara. He smiled when he saw the girl not shrinking under his gaze. Thank you, great father. She too conveyed her gratitude, wearing a bright smile on her face, looking straight into his eyes. Darius' smile widened at her words. She had inborn confidence in her bones, and she was a true Angelini, brave, steadfast, but clever. You have not only inherited your mother's eyes, but also her personality. Darius gently spoke, and his voice contained affection for his late granddaughter. She would have been proud of you. I never knew her, but I would love to hear more about her. Would you tell me? She was not a simple girl, and Darius' words did not bother her or made her emotional over the fact that she never knew her birth mother, rather she honestly conveyed her desire to learn about her mother. Of course, Darius nodded to her, and then he started telling Kiara about how her mother was in her childhood. Keith excused himself tactfully, letting the great father and the great daughter have some alone time. Yinjing and Victor were relieved to see him come out of the study with a happy smile on his face. And Saul took a look inside the room before closing the door again. At ease, he gave the command to his two bodyguards and then walked a little away to make a call to Damien Angelini. After the brief call ended, Keith approached Saul. Uncle Damien and his family are waiting in the house 97, Boulevard Street, Greentown community. Arrange for a team to secretly bring them here. You must make sure that no one gets the gist of their presence in the city. The Demiliore force stationed inside the house will cooperate with you. I will make the arrangements. Saul accepted his words and left the lounge to get to work. Chapter 15 Damien Angelini was a man who looked to be in his late 20s, but the truth was that he was 41 years old. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, and his stocky muscular physique, coupled with his handsome yet hardened face, could easily intimidate the best of the men. And that was without taking into account the oppressive demeanor with which he carried himself. However, right now, he was wearing a very gentle smile with tears in his eyes as he looked at the young girl standing in front of him. Kiara, this is your maternal uncle, Damien, Major General, and third in command of Netherian Dragon Corps. And Uncle Damien, this is Kiara Angelini, a middle school ace student, your niece and now your daughter. He chuckled as he introduced her. Brother, Kiara pouted in a complaint about mentioning that she was an ace student. She was a little embarrassed as she felt that it was something insignificant to be mentioned, and she knew that Keith was deliberately pulling her leg. Hello, uncle. She then turned to look at Damien and smiled brightly. From the moment she saw him, she felt a familial connection that made her feel at ease in his intimidating presence. And she was not faking that bright smile. She really was happy to meet him. Damien's smile widened after her greeting, and he stepped forward to gently pat her head. It's better to address me as your father from now on. He was not a man of words and was never really good at expressing his emotions through words, so he did not bother saying anything else to her. Okay, father. She giggled and nodded her head readily. For some reason, she did not find it strange at all to address him as her father. It naturally rolled off her tongue, and looking at him as her father made her feel safer. Good. Damien was pleased and laughed heartily. Come, I will introduce you to your mother and your little brother. Are you not going to see great father? She curiously looked him in the eyes and asked, which made him tense up. He's waiting for you. Damien frowned at her words and then closed his eyes, trying to calm down his turbulent heart. Yes, he had come here for her, willing to take his responsibilities, but that did not mean that he had let go of all the grudges in his heart. He knew that it was unfair to hold his grandfather responsible for everything that happened, but he just could not help his feelings. He always felt that if Darius had intervened in the matters back then, the tragedy could have been avoided. And so, it was more of disappointment than anger that he felt towards his family's old man. Please, father, Kiara pleadingly called out to him. Great father is very old now. Let's not pain his old heart anymore. He told me that he terribly misses you. All right, I will listen to you. Damien just couldn't bring himself to refuse her. It was the first thing she had asked of him, how could he refuse her? Inside his heart, he was nervously chuckling as he found her personality just the same as that of her late mother. Damien just hoped that she did not inherit the menacing side of his sister's personality, or else they were all in a lot of trouble. But some part of his heart was really hoping to see such a side of her. Keith smiled when he saw his little sister being clever as ever, and appreciatively patted her head. Uncle, you can take your time with great father. I will introduce Kiara to Aunt Danielle and little Ben. Damien nodded to his words, and then looked at the two siblings again. He was immensely relieved in his heart to see that the two got along really well. At first, he had his reservations against Keith's plan to marry her, and he had already vowed to make an enemy out of him if he found Kiara against the idea. But now it seemed that his worries were unnecessary. It was clear by the way she looked at him that she loved him dearly. After Damien walked past them and entered the study to meet his grandfather, Keith grabbed Kiara's hand and led her to the lounge where Danielle and Benjamin Angelini were sitting. Seeing the two of them walk in, a little chubby boy, around the age of 6 happily ran over to them. Keith, he happily called out and curiously looked at Kiara, intrigued by her beauty and eyes that were the same as his. Who's this beautiful girl? She's your older sister, Ben. Keith ruffled his head. Really? The sudden gleam in the little boy's eyes melted Kiara's heart and she crouched down to gently pull on his chubby cheeks. Yes, I am your older sister, Ben, and we will be living together from now on. Wow, Ben did not mind that his cheeks were pulled. He was quite used to people pulling on them, and Kiara was being very gentle, so he had no complaints. Mama, see, I have an older sister too now. Can I go play with her? He expectantly looked at his mother, who had just come over. Not now, Ben. You first have to meet your great father, Danielle gently said, and after Ben obediently nodded his head, she patted him before looking at Kiara curiously. The two of them curiously looked into each other's eyes. Just like her and Damien, Danielle too possessed those same blue eyes, but her hair was not the shade of dark brown like her son and husband but was black, a shade duller than hers, but close enough. Danielle seemed to have sensed what was going on in Kiara's mind and she smiled brightly. I am an Angelini too, and I belong to the Cameron City Angelini family. There were several Angelini branch families that were settled in different cities of Netherlands and Italy, and Danielle belonged to Cameron City, which was a metropolitan city in the neighboring province of Melodia. Kiara understandably nodded her head, and then brightly smiled at her. You are beautiful, she honestly said. Danielle possessed a very warm and motherly aura about her. She was of an average height, but her figure was simply perfect. Round, but wide hips, slim waist, ample blossom, long neck, and coupled with her Angelini features, she possessed an innocent heart-shaped face that was quite beautiful to look at and admire. Thank you, Danielle was pleased with her words. But I must say that my beauty is nothing when compared to you. It's simply enviable that you are even more beautiful than Alicia. She teasingly pouted, which made Ben and Keith chuckle at her words. She knew that she was beautiful, but compared to Kiara, she felt that she was rather pale. It was just the same feeling she felt when she was around Alicia, who was Kiara's real mother. And since women were creatures of envy, and she was not cleansed of this sin, she could not help but envy her a little, and voiced her thoughts honestly. Thank you, mother. She knew her charm and was used to having eyes filled with envy staring at her, but Danielle's words made her feel warm in her heart as they were honest but devoid of any ill feelings. Hearing Kiara call her mother, Danielle sighed in her heart and stepped forward to hug her, and planted a kiss on her head. Your mother and I were best of friends, and I promise you that I will always take care of you as if you are my own child. She gently spoke to her. Never shy away from me, and if you have any troubles, do speak to me. I will be your mother, and I will be your friend so that my dear daughter can talk about her feelings freely with me. Listening to her words, Kiara's eyes couldn't help but turn misty. She obediently nodded her head, finding it hard to find words to reply to her, and subconsciously tightened her arms around her, which made Danielle happy at being accepted by her. Perhaps it was because of their blood relationship that Kiara felt much closer to Damien and Danielle in a few minutes than she did to her adopted parents who had raised her all her life. And this familial blood connection came with a sense of security that made her feel protected. She had been quite nervous about everything, but it was all turning out to be a happy affair that she appreciated from the bottom of her heart. Keith stayed on the side smiling as he looked at the two of them chatting happily. They could easily pass as mother and daughter, and he was relieved to see that Danielle looked at Kiara as her own child. As the memories of what the future would have been like had he kept Kiara's existence a secret emerged in his mind, he could not help but shake his head in disappointment at himself in those memories. Just because he was too cautious about her safety and fearful of his mother, he had deprived her of the happiness that she deserved. This is how things were meant to be, and Kiara deserved to be surrounded by her blood family. Keith felt like a burden that had been weighing on his heart was lifted, but at the same time, he was a little apprehensive of his mother's wrath that he would have to face and prevail through. Keith, Ben happily grabbed his hand when he found his mother busy talking with Kiara. Come, let's play chess. I will beat you this time. Okay, he chuckled and allowed the little boy to lead him over to the seats in the corner where a chessboard was placed. They had a game earlier in the morning when he met them, and Keith later helped Ben beat Damien in a match, which made the little boy his fan. Needless to say, the little boy stood no chance against a villain like him, who was unwilling to let him win. Chapter 16 Keith walked towards the Demiliore Manor with his hands in his pockets, leisurely looking at the dark sky that was showering the first snow of the winter in Samarin. Yinjing and Victor were quite surprised to see him totally comfortable in the cold weather. They knew very well that Keith had not yet started cultivating, but it did not look like he was pretending to not be bothered by the cold. Master, shall I bring your coat? Yinjing politely asked. No need. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, exhaling a small cloud of fog. You should have told me earlier that cold feels so pleasant once you have broken past the body refinement stage, and I wouldn't have wasted so many years not cultivating. Master, Victor's eyes widened in astonishment. You are. He smiled at their reaction and drew his hand to Yinjing. Understanding what he was asking her to do, she took a step forward and grabbed it, scanning his body. Peak of foundation, profound realm. The disbelief in her voice reflected the chaos her mind was in. The shock proved too much for the cold Yinjing, who had trained for years to control her emotions. Peak of foundation, profound realm. Victor looked at Keith in amazement. He knew that Yinjing would never joke about it. Master, when did you start cultivating? On Friday morning, Keith smirked at him and replied. Are you serious? Yes. He seriously nodded his head. What? Victor was a simple-minded man and believed his master's words without doubting them. How is that possible? But the question still remained. Yinjing was much calmer than Victor, but her mind was in chaos too. She remembered checking Keith's body on Friday morning when he had abruptly woken up from a nightmare. He had not started cultivating at that time, and now, 2 days later, he is at the peak of foundation, profound realm. There were no words that could describe the situation. To start on the path of cultivation was not an easy task. The first realm of the 5 mortal realms was the foundation, profound realm, and it was the trickiest of all 5. There were 3 phases of foundation, profound realm: aura circulation, body refinement, and finally, aura soul formation. For a person to complete an aura circulation, opening all the aura channels in their body, usually took around 7 to 12 months. For some inborn geniuses, it still took up to 5 months. The next stage of body refinement was harder and required more time. Even Yinjing, who was hailed as a genius, took 12 months to successfully refine her body. However, the most difficult phase was the aura soul formation, where the aura of the person starts taking the form of a beast, depending on the personality of the individual. And the completion of aura soul generally took 5 to 8 years. It also depended on the type of beast he formed, but for someone to successfully form his aura soul in less than 4 years was unheard of. Don't tell anyone about it. And if someone asks you later, tell them that I have been cultivating for 5 years. Okay, he seriously said to the 2 of them. Aye, yes, master. Both Victor and Yinjing nodded their heads and managed to gather their wits, but their hearts were now uncomfortable. They spent years to get past the foundation, profound realm, and their master was on the verge of stepping out of it in just 2 days. How could it not make them feel uncomfortable? If he continues cultivating at this pace, would he still have a need for them to guard him? Won't they become useless? Keith was not worried that they would give away his secret. The 2 of them were his most trusted subordinates, and unlike the rest of the shadow guards in the Demiliore family, the 2 of them were only answerable to him alone. And he had deliberately revealed the secret to them, to make them uncomfortable. And in just a minute, he saw the result he wanted to see. Yinjing and Victor's eyes were brimming with determination to get stronger. Ever since the 2 of them had taken the job of his bodyguards, they had not had enough time on their hands to cultivate. It was especially the case with Yinjing, who had been stuck in the late stage of Great Profound Realm for 4 years now. Focus on getting stronger if you want to stay by my side, he simply said without looking at them, and they both nodded to his command. Victor was at the peak of nascent Profound Realm, only a step away from entering the Great Profound Realm. And he was determined to enter the next realm before Keith breaks past the foundation Profound Realm and enters the nascent Profound Realm. And as soon as Keith entered the manor, he darted off towards his quarters to cultivate. Go and get some rest, Keith commanded Yinjing, who was still following him, before walking towards his mother's room. When he arrived outside her room, he came across a middle-aged woman who looked to be in her mid-40s. She had peculiar grey hair, which was not because of her old age, but the natural color of her hair, and as soon as she saw him, she respectfully lowered her head. Is mother in her room, Sybil? Yes, young master. Did you tell her where I went today? The sudden question froze her mind, but then she recovered and kept her head lowered, not saying anything. Go, get some rest. Don't stand here. He was not angry with her for what she had done. She was his mother's shadow, just like Yinjing was his shadow, and her job was to do as her master commanded. Sybil was responsible for gathering information for his mother, and he knew that his activities of the day did not miss her. He had asked Cesar to not try to cover his tracks when he visited the Angelini estate. Keith knocked on the door of his mother's room after Sybil walked away, and without waiting for her call, he entered and closed the door behind him. Mother, he politely greeted her when he found her sitting on the couch, with her pet mountain lion resting its head in her lap. She was softly running her fingers through its coat, brushing it, which was making the big cat purr in satisfaction. His heart constricted when she raised her head to look at him with those tear-stricken red eyes. And he immediately walked up to her in worry. His movement disturbed the big cat, but it simply jumped off the couch and walked to the other side of the room, as if understanding that it better not be around what was about to happen. Where were you? Vanessa asked in a hoarse voice. Keith frowned at the coldness in her voice and came to stand right in front of her, looking her in the eyes. You already know where I was, mother. I want to hear it from your mouth, she coldly said, which only made him frown deeper. I went to see great father. As soon as he said that, Vanessa stood up, clenching her fists tightly, trying her best to control the urge to slap him. Why, you can hit me if you want, mother. He lightly smiled at her and said, not answering her question. And he got what he asked for. A loud smack sounded out in the room after Vanessa's palm connected his left cheek. Had it been anyone else, Keith would have sentenced that person to death in his heart. But it was not someone else but his mother, and he did not mind it. He was actually relieved that she hit him because she managed to control her rage as soon as she hit him, regretting it. It was the first time in her life that she had raised her hand at him, and the tears slipped out of her left eye in pain. Why would you go there? She asked, half crying. Because I had to, mother. He turned to look at her in the eyes and said, it is for the best of our family. They killed my father and brother. My mother died because she could not cope with the loss of her husband and son. They were your grandparents and uncle. She hysterically shouted at him. How could you do this to me? She rested her forehead on his chest and smacked it with her fist, again and again, repeating the question. But Keith stayed silent. Greatfather lost his daughter and son-in-law, and he lost his son and daughter-in-law. He lost his grandchildren, and now only you and Uncle Damien remain. Tell me, mother, is his loss any less than ours? He questioned her once she calmed down. It was his son who took the first step. She pushed him away and glared at him. It was them that started it all. And now they are on the verge of destruction. Then let them be destroyed, she dangerously said. It should not be your concern. Keith lightly smiled at her when he heard her words. They are family, mother. He is your grandfather, and Uncle Damien is your cousin, he lightly said. Are you really asking us to turn our backs on them when the enemies are ready to devour them? His words only angered Vanessa more. Who is she? And she finally got to the point that worried her the most. Who is who, mother? He playfully asked. The girl you took with yourself to the Angelini estate. Keith turned silent after he heard her words, and kept looking her in the eyes. Did grandfather call you? He guessed and asked, and Vanessa's silence meant that he guessed right. Chapter 17. Keith knew that his grandfather would not reveal the identity of Kiara to his mother. He would never want to interfere in this matter. Her name is Kiara. She is my fiancée, and the future lady of the Demiliore family. He looked into her deep brown eyes and answered her question. I asked you, who is she? Vanessa narrowed her eyes dangerously at him, which made Keith frown. She is Alicia Angelini's daughter, my half-sister. He did not hide the truth from her because he knew that she would figure it out eventually. The resemblance Kiara shared with Alicia was not weak. Even if others don't see through it, Vanessa would not miss it. As soon as Vanessa heard his words, her mind felt light and dizzy, making her stagger. Mother. Keith immediately rushed forward and locked her in his embrace, supporting her. His heart trembled when he heard her start sobbing and picked her up in his arms before sitting on the couch. He did not dare to let go of her, and tightened his embrace, slowly stroking her back. If there was one person Vanessa hated the most in her life, it was Alicia. And the hatred had not gone away even after the latter's death. The relationship Vanessa shared with her was very complicated. When young, the two girls were like sisters, inseparable. But once they grew up, they drifted away because they desired the same thing. And it was Keith's father, Michael. They both wanted to become his first wife, future lady of the Demiliore family, and since only one of them could have that position, they started looking at each other as enemies. As fate would have it, Vanessa ended up becoming the lady of the Demiliore family after the Angelini family broke the marriage pact between Michael and Alicia. She won, but that was not the end of it all. Tragedy struck, and the man she loved the most ended up broken as well. Michael loved Alicia, and even after it looked like they were not meant to be, he still did not give up on her even if it meant war. But things were not that simple. When Michael realized that he could not bring Alicia into the family as his second wife, after all the blood that had been shed, he made the gravest mistake of his life. He decided to hand over the position of the master of the family back to his father, and gave all the business responsibilities to his wife, so that he could quietly go away with Alicia, leaving their families behind. I will kill her, Keith. Vanessa faintly spoke after she regained some composure, and it made Keith tremble under the cold chill that spread in his heart. I will kill her just like I killed her wretched mother. Keith closed his eyes in pain when he heard her words, and tightened his arms around her. He remained silent for a while, and after Vanessa finally stopped sobbing, he planted a kiss on her head. You won't harm her, mother, he lightly said to her. His words made her dangerously smile, and she raised her head to look him right in his eyes. Is it a dare or threat? She coldly asked. A threat, mother, Keith replied with an equally dangerous glint in his eyes. His answer made her heart go cold, and the smile on her face stiffened. You are just like your weak father, I am not like him. He shook his head and cut her off. I won't leave you alone. Never. He leaned in and planted a kiss on her forehead. Keith still remembered vividly the day his father died. He was with him in the car when his father received that call, informing him that Alicia had been killed. He still remembered the tears that had immediately poured out of his eyes, he remembered the mournful cry that escaped his mouth after the call ended. And he still remembered the crash that followed. His father had lost himself to his grief and lost control of the car, which ended up with a head-on collision with the truck. But at the last moment, he did regain some clarity and shielded his son with his body. Protect your little sister for me, Keith. I know I am a useless father, but promise me this selfish request. Protect her from your mother. The words of his father before he took his last breath were still fresh in his mind. I hate him too, mother. He lightly smiled at her. His words were honest. The injuries Michael had suffered in the crash were fatal, but a cultivator like him could have survived through it all if he had the will to. But Michael wanted to die and join Alicia in the hereafter, his guilt would not let him live. And I hated Aunt Alicia too for a while, but I could never bring myself to hate Kiara. He wiped his mother's tears with the back of his fingers and stared right into her eyes. I love her, he told her, and her body trembled at his words. But I would never leave you for her, he promised her and gently smiled. And I would never leave her for you. Rage, anguish, betrayal, helplessness, and pain washed over Vanessa when she heard his words. She stole my husband, and her daughter steals my son from me, she mockingly laughed. Mother, he raised his voice at her and coldly looked her in the eyes, jolting her away from her madness. Why, did I say anything wrong? She sweetly smiled at him, but her pain was clearly reflecting on her face. Yes, you are wrong. His eyes softened when he saw her in pain. No one, not even Kiara, can replace you in my heart. How can anyone replace you? You are my mother. He planted a kiss on her forehead. I love you. Vanessa half smiled at his words and then pushed him away, freeing herself from his arms and standing up on her feet. You are a good liar, Keith. But your mother can see through you, she coldly said. Get out of my room. Keith frowned at her words and stood up, facing her. She shied her eyes away from him, but he did not miss on the glint of madness in them. And his heart turned cold. You must not harm her, mother, he threateningly said and heard her madly laugh at his words. I will kill her, my dear son. She smirked at him. You lied to me for her. And you say you love me, but only because you want to protect her. Doesn't that mean that you only love her, little Keith? She stepped forward and gently caressed his cheek. Mother promises you, if you kill yourself after losing her, your mother will kill herself too. Because I do love you. Keith lowered his head when he heard her words, and his body trembled in rage. Seeing his reaction, Vanessa smiled brightly. What's wrong, my dear child? She sweetly asked. Do you now want to kill your mother to protect the girl you love? You think you know me, mother. You don't, he coldly said and stepped forward, capturing her lips. His brazen hands clawed her dress and started ripping it apart before she could even understand what was happening. Vanessa's mind went blank the moment Keith's lips were planted on her. Her eyes were widened in shock, and her heart slowed down before it started racing madly. Keith, what are you doing? She asked in disbelief when she was thrown onto her bed and saw her son taking off his clothes. Why, mother, are you scared? There was madness reflecting in his eyes that made her heart palpitate in fear, but at the same time, the deepest and darkest desire in her heart started spilling out. He gave her no time to react and climbed on top of her, right between her legs, pressing her under his weight. She writhed in the struggle a little, with the heat emanating from his body against her naked skin was too comforting for her to really resist it. I did not lie to you. He evilly chuckled as he slid her panties away, and then pressed the glands against her burning lower lips. He leaned down and captured her soft warm lips again before separating from her and locking eyes with her. He gently pressed his weight forward, and his member slid inside of her warm cave. The moment he broke inside her body, her breath got stuck in her throat, and a tear slipped out of his right eye. Little by little, he kept entering her, and filled her depths to the brim, all the while keeping his eyes locked with hers. Her warm, wet, velvety folds wrapped tightly around him, and the pleasure that shot through his spine flared the fire in his loins. It feels heavenly inside of you, mother. He grinned at her as he saw the tears pooling out of her eyes. Why, Keith? She stared into his eyes and asked in a conflicted expression. Because I want you, he replied and then started moving inside of her, gently, but with deep thrusts. Keith sneaked his hand under her back and unclasped her bra, freeing her supple and large breasts from the captivity. He then used his left hand to play with her mound, squeezing and clawing it, losing himself to its soft suppleness. And when he teased her pink nipple, pinching it, he earned a pleasurable whimper from her. He hardened his thrusts inside of her when he saw her trying to resist him, hitting the door of her womb every time after nearly pulling out of her. Feeling her insides tightening around him and secreting more love juices as a result of his assault and her flaring lust, he chuckled and leaned near her ear. You think that I do not know about your obsession with me, mother? His words made her body tremble, and she shied her eyes away from him, but now she no longer tried to suppress her moans. Vanessa locked her arms around his neck, and her right hand gently caressed and pulled the hair on his head. Closing the distance between them, she started planting wet kisses on his neck as she nuzzled her face into it, inhaling his scent that made her warmer. Faster, she whispered near his ear as the itch inside her lower body got stronger. Yes, mother, he playfully said and increased his pace. As if provoked by his words, she wrapped her toned-long legs around him and pulled him harder onto her. It had been years since she last had sex, but that did not mean that she was an inexperienced lady who would turn mushy under his assault. Her walls started squeezing him harder, and soon Keith started grunting as he tried to not lose to the pleasure. His hands dug into the soft mattress, nearly tearing it as he resisted the urge to come inside of her. Give up, baby, Vanessa smirked when she saw her son trying to resist the pleasure she was giving him. Your mother wants you to paint her insides with your essence. Claim me, she devilishly whispered. Keith nearly lost himself there, but he survived. Letting go of the mattress, he used his hand to play with her breast and used his lips to nibble onto her neck while tracing her jugular vein with his tongue. Ah, a blissful moan escaped Vanessa's lips, and she found herself on the losing end. He was much bigger than his father, and his technique was not bad at all. Every thirst made her experience inexplicable pleasure, and soon she was driven by her lust, with her head getting lighter and lighter. You are mine, mother, forever and ever. He nibbled onto her earlobe after he sweetly whispered those words, and Vanessa screamed out as her mind went blank, hugging him tightly. He really wanted to go on, but when her insides suddenly clamped onto his hardness, he could no longer resist it. Tears slipped out of Vanessa's eyes as she felt the warmth burst into her womb. Her body could not stop trembling as the result of the powerful orgasm that she had just experienced, and her arms and legs soon turned soft. When Keith felt her hold loosen, he put his arms under her waist and flipped over to have her lying on top of him. He gently brushed his fingers on the fair, soft skin of her back as Vanessa rested her head on his chest, catching her breath. I love you. He planted a kiss on her head. But if you harm Kiara, I will never touch you again. As soon as he whispered those words, a dangerous gleam emerged in her eyes. And then she straddled his waist and locked his arms on top of his head. Is that so? She asked with a smile as she came close to his lips. Yes, he resolutely said but ended up hissing when she nibbled onto his lip and took his length inside of her again. You are too weak to stop me, she giggled and then started moving on top of him. The lazy mountain lion could not sleep all night due to their antics, but it was a wise animal and did not dare to voice out his dissatisfaction. Chapter 18 Inches Take Care, he gently said and sipped a kiss from her lips. Nana timidly nodded with a beautiful blush, and quickly ran out of the vehicle. He couldn't help but chuckle as he watched her brisk away towards the building of Sumerian High School, ignoring the eyes of the students that were chasing her. She had requested him to keep it low-key when they decided to go to the university together, and so he agreed. However, there was nothing low-key in his garage, and he playfully settled on the Mercedes Maybach AMG G99F. Nana did not know much about the cars, and so she thought that it really was low-key compared to the other cars in the garage. Unfortunately for her, this SUV was a limited edition vehicle, with only 99 units in the world which screamed of performance and luxury. Each unit cost just over 2.1 million Neris, and any car enthusiast would salivate at near the sight of one of these. There were students already whispering, and a few who recognized the model could not take their eyes off it. After Nana disappeared inside the building, he drove off towards the School of Business and Finance. The university was spread over an area of 20,000 acres, most of which was forested, and Keith had a lot of time on his mind now to mull over what happened with him last night as he drove onto the beautiful forest road. His waist was still a little stiff, and his body was feeling unusually light. It was all due to the lack of sleep, and the fervent love-making sessions with Vanessa that seemed to never end. Keith would never admit it, but he was scared of his mother's insatiable lust now. She was a succubus, and she let out all of her years of pent-up lust on him last night, not showing any mercy. He experienced pleasure that he had never before felt in his life, and he could still feel the lingering warmth of her body on his skin. Just a little attention to this feeling ignited a fire in his lions, and he had to bite on his lower lip to jolt himself away from the lustful reverie. Over the night, he had managed to reach a tacit agreement with her regarding Kiara, and he was at peace for now. As long as his little sister behaves herself, Vanessa would let her be. Even though he was certain that she would not make things easy for Kiara, Vanessa's willingness to tolerate his little sister was more than he could have ever asked for. Troublesome woman, he sighed and helplessly shook his head, but couldn't help the smile that crept on his lips. Yes, she was a pain, but she was his mother, and one of the only two women he really loved in his life. Keith parked the car in his usual parking spot, and calmly got out. He didn't need it, but he still put on the royal blue trench coat before walking towards the building. As usual, there were whispers around him, with people waving at him and greeting him with smiles. However, no one came forward to bother him. It was 9:45 a.m., and there were still 45 minutes left in the start of the day's first lecture, so Keith decided to finish the official procedure of his application for autonomous learning. Aunt May had already submitted the application on his behalf on the Friday morning, so all he had to do now was visit the dean's office to collect the official form signed by the dean, recheck the details, sign it, and submit it to the program coordinator's office. My apologies, Mr. Demiliore, Dean Marcus is attending a meeting right now. A middle-aged, well-kept secretary greeted him, and then handed him his signed autonomous learning form. He asked me to give this to you in case you come here early in the morning. Thank you. Keith nodded to her and then walked off towards the program coordinator's office. He checked the details one last time before signing it, and then entered the office after knocking once. An old man in his late 50s, wearing horn-rimmed glasses, lifted his eyes from the computer and looked at him. Mr. Demiliore. After realizing who had entered the office, his demeanor swiftly changed and he respectfully stood up to greet him. Coordinator Wells. He nodded to the old man and then looked at the beautiful lady that was sitting in the office, holding a file. Miss Grayson. He politely smiled at the golden blonde girl. Heir Demiliore. She looked at him in surprise, but masked it well and replied politely before getting back to filling a form. Keith did not know why the young lady of the Grayson family was in the office, and he did not really care about it. How may I help you, Mr. Demiliore? Wells smiled and asked. I am here to submit this form. Keith simply handed it over, and the coordinator was quite surprised to see what the form was about. Do you want to check the information one last time? I have checked it, it's all good. After Keith's reply, the coordinator got to work and scanned the form before working on it. All done. The coordinator smiled at him. You don't need to attend the university after the finals of the ongoing semester. 3 years later, assessment exams will be held, and you will have to go through them before joining back the class in the last semester. The date sheet of assessment exams will be sent to your mail 4 weeks prior to the exams. Thank you. Keith smiled at him and then glanced at Rebecca Grayson, who was still pretending to read the file, before walking out of the office. The Grayson family was a powerful and wealthy family that arrived in the Sumerian city over 100 years ago. Recognized as one of the 6 major families in the Sumerian city, the Grayson were part of the same fraternity as the Demiliore family. However, contrary to public view, the relationship between the two families was not harmonious in the least. It was mainly because all the industries that the Grayson operated in were ruled by Demiliore family, and the Grayson wanted to surmount them, which led the two in a constant business warfare. For Demiliore, it was a healthy competition, but for Grayson, it was a constant struggle. Rebecca Grayson was the first child of current master of the Grayson family, and elder sister of Julian Grayson, who was the heir of the Grayson family, and Keith's classmate. As Keith walked over to his class, his mind was occupied with the thought of Rebecca and what the future held. This beautiful golden blonde girl was among the main heroines of the story, and was Yetian's future second wife. Though the Grayson, Lynn, and Falcon families were not individually as strong as the Demiliore family, together they could push the Demiliore to a stalemate. And that was what happened in his dream of the future. His heart clenched when he recalled how his mother had fought after his death. She alone had rained hell on the city in her vengeance, nearly destroying the 3 families, killing the key supporting characters, but how could she have won against the child of destiny? When Yetian saw that the Demiliore could not be taken out with power and wealth even after losing their heir, he had grown mad. And then, driven by rage and guilt of losing the people that supported him, he took the matters in his hands and assassinated Vanessa, ready to bear all the consequences. However, at the last moment, his loyal subordinate saved him by becoming a scapegoat. Just another perk of being the child of destiny, you could always bail out of any dire situation. Hey, Keith. As soon as he entered the class, a group of boys came over to him. Hey, resting his thoughts aside, he greeted the boys with a light smile. His amiable expression did not let out any trace of coldness in his heart that he felt towards most of them. Where have you been? A burly brow-haired boy, who was his childhood friend, sternly asked. You did not show up in the fight club, and you did not even pick up the calls or check our messages. I was busy, Hal. Family duties. Keith cut him off and briefly said. Oh, and that was enough of an explanation for Hal. Ah well, it can't be helped. But Keith, you missed out on a wonderful fight. An underdog managed to take out the hot favorite in the second round, but lost in the third round to the crippled opponent. A healthy boy, with neat short black hair, enthusiastically informed him. Don't talk about it, James. I lost so much money because of him. The tallest in the group with a goatee, whose name was Eric, groaned and complained, and the 2 other boys, who had remained silent, nodded their heads. Serves you well. James shot back at him and then turned to look at Keith. We are planning for a drag race on the weekend. Up for it. I am out. Keith shook his head and sat back on his desk. Come on, Julian is going to. It will be fun. James insisted, but Keith shook his head. I am busy these days. You guys have fun. Hey, Keith. Demiliore refusing a car race, that's a new one. A blonde boy with a chiseled jaw and blue eyes walked up to them and smiled brightly. Lucky you, you will get to win this time. Keith smirked at him, which caused the boys around him to chuckle at his words. I guess so, but it won't be fun. Julian sighed and sat on a desk too, facing him. I heard that you are applying for autonomous learning. What? Everyone who heard those words looked at Keith in shock, but he ignored them. Rebecca. Julian nodded his head, not denying it. So what are you up to? Joining your family business? No. He shook his head. I am planning on starting my own business. There was no need to hide that information as everyone would get to know about it in a couple of weeks, and so he himself revealed it to them. What sort of business? Julian curiously asked, and everyone looked at him waiting for his answer. Real estate. His answer pretty much disappointed them as it was not something new and fun. Demiliore family was already in real estate business, which would help Keith a lot, and so it was a safe choice. That's no fun. James voiced out his thoughts, expressing disinterest in the subject. So you had a wild night, eh? He teasingly asked when he caught sight of a hickey on Keith's neck. Keith only smiled back at him, not saying anything, and then stood up to sit down on his chair. The rest of the boys scurried away too as the lecturer entered the class. Hal was about to sit beside Keith when someone came over. Excuse me, may I sit here? The beautiful girl politely asked, and Hal was shocked to see who it was. Sure. He nodded his head and walked away, glancing at Keith and the girl meaningfully. Good morning, Miss Lynn. Keith lightly smiled and greeted her. Good morning, Heir Demiliore. King lightly smiled at him. I want to formally invite you to tonight's dinner at our home. Not a party, Keith smirked. Mother does not want to hold a party. King shook her head. But she would hold it if you want one. Her words. No need. Dinner is fine. Keith smiled and accepted the invitation. Chapter 19 Inches a dinner, Heir. Vanessa smirked when Keith informed her about his plans for the evening. Do you want that girl? She straightforwardly asked. Yes. He simply nodded and kept stroking her back as they cuddled on the couch. Vanessa took the day off work and stayed at home waiting for him to return from the university. She prepared lunch for him and fed him with her hands before climbing over and cuddling with him, talking about miscellaneous things. His honest admission surprised Vanessa, and she couldn't help but frown. A plaything or a wife? A wife. King is special. And what makes her special? Vanessa raised her head and looked at his face. She's intelligent, clever, motivated, and almost as beautiful as you. He planted a kiss on her forehead and smiled at her. His words were an admission that she was more beautiful than her, which pleased her. She will make a good daughter-in-law to you. It won't be easy. Her father won't cave in and allow his eldest child to become a second wife to you. If it was the position of the lady of Demiliore family. I don't need his permission. A cold glint flashed in his eyes. What I want belongs to me, and if he stands in the way, he will be eliminated. He also knew that Vanessa was deliberately saying it, so that she could favor King over Kiara, but he was not going to allow anyone to bully his little sister. The coldness in his voice made her body go stiff. It was for the first time in her life that she heard him speak so coldly, not hiding the malice in his voice. It was as if Lynn Houghton and him had some sort of fraternal hatred. Lynn family is not as powerful as our family, but they are worth over 60 billion neres. It won't be easy to deal with him. Vanessa did not dissuade him, but reminded him. Don't do anything reckless. Why would I do anything reckless? He chuckled at her words. My dearest mother, it is you who is going to help me destroy Lynn Houghton. Once he is weakened, he will be helpless against the wish of his daughter. Vanessa frowned at his words and got out of his arms, sitting on his side and narrowing her eyes at him. His hands are not clean, and if done right, the Lynn family will come crashing down once his deeds are exposed. He knew that he finally had his mother's attention, so he got to the point. I have information about his deeds. Vanessa was an ambitious woman, and she had always wanted to weaken the major families in the city. However, ever since she had taken the charge of the business, her focus was solely on making sure that their family regained absolute control over the public companies under their group, so she had not had time to deal with those families. In last 12 years, the net worth of their family had fallen from 75 billion neres to now 66 billion neres, and the reason behind it was her goal to buy back the shares of the public companies to ensure that Demiliore family owned more than 66% of the shares in each of them. Yes, there was a loss in the family's net worth, but in turn, their family business was more secure than ever. Evidence or speculation? Keith smiled at her words and then started typing on his cell phone, listing down the crimes and unethical activities of Lynn Houghton that included scandalous affairs, murder, arson, corporate espionage, bribery, and dealings with underworld forces to eliminate his competition. Of course, these were all crimes that almost all the powerful people in the world were not innocent of, and the key lied in the existence of evidence, otherwise, it was all baseless accusations. When Vanessa received the message and saw how detailed the information Keith had on Lynn Houghton's crimes, she did not feel happy or doubted the information, but rather felt uneasy in her heart. How did you get all this information? She looked him in the eyes and asked. It is just information, mother. You still need to investigate it and collect evidence with your power. Keith, she stressed her voice, where did you get the information from? Don't worry, it was a trusted source, a source that cannot betray us. He could understand the reason why Vanessa was apprehensive. If they took a wrong step, there would be severe backlash. As for what the trusted source is, I won't tell you that. He looked her in the eyes and said straightforwardly, there is no rush and I want you to do things slowly. But make sure that within 3 years, Lynn Houghton is at his weakest. Vanessa looked him in the eyes without saying anything, and the uneasy feeling in her heart grew stronger. It was as if her child was hiding a lot of things from her, and the earlier coldness in his voice made her feel like he had suffered a lot at someone's hand. The malice his voice contained was not false when he talked about eliminating Lynn Houghton. Vanessa did not say anything and left the room after nodding to him, ready to mobilize their family forces to collect the evidence against Lynn Houghton. She did not care how that man had hurt or upset her son, she was going to make sure that he was destroyed. Her child was her reverse scale. Keith watched her leave the room with a light smile on his lips. He had complete faith in her methods, and so he was not worried about their family name being dragged in all the fiasco that was about to befall the Lynn family. The Lynn would not even know what hit them, and why everything was happening. Yinjing, bring me my laptop. He ordered and then sank back in the couch, closing his eyes. He had thought about it long enough, and he had decided to not wait for the appearance of Yetian before dealing with his enemies. Of course he was not going to eliminate them right away, but he could make them utterly weak and ready to be slaughtered at the right time. After Yunjing brought him his laptop, he spent the rest of the afternoon working on his business plans. Aunt May had successfully secured the land of the failing real estate company that he had asked for, and now she was working with her son to secure the other piece of land. Keith carefully went through all of the list and information of the employees that were hired by Aunt May, and then went through the information he had asked Cesar to collect. He stared at the picture of a beautiful girl for a while, debating if he should get her now or wait. His only concern was that his involvement might result in unforeseen circumstances, and the child of destiny, who she was destined for, might awaken ahead of time. Had she been just a vase, he would have not cared about it, but she was a secondary heroine. The fate of the child of destiny was majorly connected to their mates, and Keith was well aware of this fact. There were the main heroines, secondary heroines, quasi-heroines, and then there were the vases. The vases contributed to the fate too, but it was negligible when compared with the main heroines, secondary heroines, and quasi-heroines. Kinyu was the destined main heroine of Yetian, while Rebecca was the secondary heroine. Similarly, the girl in the picture was a secondary heroine of a child of destiny, who would appear 5 years from now. Keith's brows furrowed deeper the more he looked at the picture, and he inadvertently glanced at the date displayed at the bottom of the screen. 5 years from now, the child of destiny with the template of rebirth of an immortal would appear. He was not worried that he would not be able to steal this girl at that time, but it was going to be very troublesome. Amelia Montail, the sacred architect, the queen of thorns, possessor of the runic monarch profound veins. A woman who only sees benefits and cons and has no room for love in her life, but once she allows a man in her heart, she would forever remain loyal to him. He smiled coldly. You are worth the risk, he decided in his heart and immediately called Cesar. Uncle Cesar, we will be leaving for Magic City tomorrow morning. Make the arrangements. Chapter 28 Cosmic Break. Lord Bentley Express 100 GT entered the gates of the Lin Mansion, stopping right under the drive-through portico. Welcome to the Lin Mansion, young Master Demiliore. A butler and a maid stepped forward to receive him and politely bowed. Good evening. Keith nodded at them and handed the key of the car to the butler. Mistress Celine ordered me to lead you to her study when you arrive, young master. The maid informed him. Lead the way, he smiled and said. The maid was flustered when she saw his smile, but soon recovered and apologetically bowed to him before leading him inside the mansion. It was quite a nice place to live in, extravagant, yet giving a simplistic impression. And Keith did not shy away from curiously looking around. He already had a set of memories of visiting this house, but in his memories it was far more extravagant than what it was now. And he could guess why that would be so. In that future timeline, the mistress of Lin family, Celine, had passed away, giving control over everything in the house to the second wife of Lin Houghton. My lady, young Master Demiliore is here. The maid knocked on the door and announced. There was no answer from inside, and it put the maid in an awkward position, but when she was about to knock again, the door opened, and Celine, wearing a brilliant smile, came out. Keith, she lightly hugged him. Thank you for accepting the invitation. How could I refuse it? He chuckled and then handed a gift bag to Celine. Thank you for inviting me on dinner, Madam Celine, it is an honor. He did not forget the etiquette that had been carved into his bones since childhood, and going to someone's house on an occasion empty-handed was impolite. Romaine Conti 2000, Celine accepted the gift bag and smiled happily when she saw which wine it was. I never thought a bottle of that year still existed in the world. Luckily, there was still one in my family's wine cellar. Keith was not humble at all, and Celine giggled at his words. Thank you. She was really happy, and it was because she was born that year that this edition was special for her. But I won't be letting you taste it on the dinner table tonight. I am going to keep it for my birthday. No worries. He did not care about such a thing. How are you feeling? Never felt better, she replied with a smile and led him inside the study. To call it a study was not quite right, since it was more of an art studio than a study. In one corner was a mini library on the study table, in another was a piano, in the middle was a lounging area, and the rest of the spacious room was an art studio with the wall adjacent to it displaying dozens of paintings. May I? He politely asked when Celine caught him curiously looking at the paintings. Of course, Keith was not pretending when he showed interest in the paintings. He always loved appreciating artworks, and even if his natural attainments in painting and calligraphy were not high, his aesthetic sense was quite sharp. Who would believe that someone as cheerful as you has a natural talent of drowning people into melancholy? He commented and sighed when he saw the first few of the paintings. Every painting was beautiful, and he could see that Celine was naturally talented in painting. However, almost everything on this wall was sad. Even the few landscapes that she had painted exuded a sense of desolation. I will take that as a compliment. Celine mischievously smiled, and then looked at her paintings again. I don't know why, but I have always been drawn to paint sadness onto the canvas. So you let out all your sad thoughts on the canvas, freeing yourself of them. Keith smirked. Must be the reason why you have such a radiant personality. Hey, she did not know if he was complimenting her or taking a jab at her, but she decided to accept it as a compliment and cheerfully smiled. Soon Keith stepped in front of a portrait, and he could not help but feel enchanted by it. It was the only painting on this wall that exuded innocence, joy, pure love, with no trace of sadness marring it. It was a patterning of a baby girl, looking at you with her soulful grey eyes that threatened to melt your heart and subconsciously brought a smile on your face. Seeing the smile creep on Keith's face, Celine felt proud and happily giggled. I hope you are not feeling sad anymore, she teased. How can I be sad after looking at those soulful grey orbs of life? Keith chuckled and turned to look Celine in the eyes. Kinyu is lucky to have inherited your perfect genes. Celine knew that his words were pure admiration, but her heart betrayed her by skipping a beat and then spreading warmth on her cheeks. You are beautiful too, little Keith. She playfully shot back at him, but failed to make him fluster over her words. I know, he simply said with a smile, and then looked back at the painting. I am quite tempted to take away this painting with me, but I can see how much it means to you, so I must reluctantly give up on it. He said those words casually, but Celine could discern from them that he felt attracted to her daughter, and the brilliant smile on her face only got brighter if that was possible. Why think about the painting when you can just steal away my little Kinyu? She bared her intentions and playfully suggested. Nah, he shook his head immediately. She's not adorable anymore, he disappointedly said. You. Celine tried to pretend to be mad at him but could not help bursting out laughing at his words. Hey, I am serious, he asserted, but Celine only laughed some more. Yeah, she was about to say something when the door of the study opened and in walked the very person they were talking about. King Yu, come here, she hurriedly called her over. King Yu was quite surprised by her call, but seeing her mother's cheeks flushed and that happy smile on her face, her curiosity was fueled. Yes, Mama. Hey, where are your manners? Celine narrowed her eyes at her. Are you not going to greet Keith? King Yu rolled her eyes at her words and then happily smiled at Keith. Welcome to my house, Keith. She drew her hand forward to greet him. It's a pleasure, Miss Lin. Keith took her hand but instead of shaking it, he politely raised it and planted a light kiss on its back, making the girl burn in a furious blush and quickly retract her hand. Celine saw their interaction and giggled some, but after she caught Keith winking at her, she burst out in a full-blown laughter, catching on to his meaning. King Yu too caught the silent conversation that was taking place between her mother and Keith, but she did not know what they had earlier been talking about, so she had no clue. And now her curiosity was flaring to a whole new level. What are you two talking about? She straightforwardly asked. Oh, Celine caught her bearings and then smiled at her daughter. Keith just expressed his desire to take your painting away. He thinks you were quite adorable when you were a baby. It makes his mood bright when he looks at it. But sadly, he says that you are no longer as adorable. Mixed emotions flashed on her face as she heard her mother's words, but when she heard the last sentence, she narrowed her eyes at Keith. Oh, your mother suggested to me to steal you away from her. Keith grinned at her. Hey, no one's stealing me away from my mama. King Yu quickly shot back at him in a high-pitched voice, but the redness on her cheeks was also a clear evidence to how flustered she was. And you, she glared at her mother. Don't talk about such things. Oh, come on, I was just messing with him. Celine rolled her eyes at her daughter and hugged her lightly. No one can steal my baby girl from me. She poured all her motherly love in her words and planted a kiss on her daughter's head. Good. King Yu was embarrassed that her mother kissed her like that in front of Keith, but she did not push her away and focused on gathering her bearings. Dinner's about to be served, and grandfather sent me to call you over. Let's go. Forget what I said earlier. She's still quite adorable. Keith immediately cut in, crushing King Yu's all efforts to stabilize her emotions, and earned another round of laughter from Celine. King Yu really wanted to stomp her foot hard on the ground, but she decided to silently turn around and walk out of the door, trying her best to hide her blush from his eyes. However, her heart only grew more flustered when she heard Keith and Celine laughing happily. Don't keep grandfather waiting. She glared at her mother and reminded her before leaving the study.